40 years, this family ate dinner in the dark at the same table. 5 masters tried to fix their lamp and gave up. The last one took a cow as payment and vanished into the night. And now a stranger who walked into the village that morning picks up the lamp, pops the panel open with his thumbnail, and he understands that for 40 years, everyone looked in the wrong place. But rewind. That morning, Kang Teo opens his eyes and tastes cold dust, the kind that settles over centuries. He rolls onto his side, spits grit, and stares up through a ragged hole punched in a stone dome. A moon hangs there, too big, too close, cracked across its face like a dropped plate. That is not his moon, that is not his sky. The last thing he remembers is a beam falling toward his face in a museum basement in Seoul. And now he sits in the rubble of a dead world. His mind does what it always does. It reads the room. Pointed arches, 4 centuries of settling minimum. Glass blown inward so the blow came from outside. His finger drags along a crack in a black basalt column. Just habit, the way he always touches broken things. And the crack closes. Stone knits under his fingertip like clay smoothing itself. Warm, seamless. The crack never existed. He turns his hand over, looks at the column, looks at the hand again. And he does not scream. He does not pray. He looks at the broken world and says quietly to no one, "Fine. Second chance. Let us do it properly. What needs fixing first?" He stands. The body is wrong. Younger, leaner. The knees do not ache the way they ached for 6 years. But the hands are his. Same long fingers. Same calluses from 10,000 hours of restoration tools. He walks through the ruins, not exploring, surveying. Every step feeds him data. This was a city, a real one. Roads for 4 carts abreast, aqueducts on the rooftops, glass windows, copper guttering. All of it dead, all of it broken in the same instant. Blast radiating from the center outward. One event, not a siege. He touches a wall fragment and feels it behind his eyes, a pulling, like a headache that will not finish forming. The wall remembers being whole, and something in him answers. He touches a chunk of fused machinery and the pull turns sharp, almost painful. This thing wants to be whole. He lets go, steps back. Not yet. You do not repair what you do not understand. You study first, then you fix. It takes 3 hours to climb out. 3 hours over collapsed halls and streets choked with vine. Beyond the wall, a valley spreads green and neglected, wild fields, a muddy river, and an hour downhill, a cluster of wooden houses breathing smoke from a chimney. People. He looks back at the dead city, then at the living village, then at his hands. He walks downhill. The village is called Mali Skol. A boy of 12 hauls water from a well that eats 40 pulls of the rope for half a bucket. Teo watches 1 minute. The counterweight has fallen off. The drum bearing is seized with rust. The rope is frayed to a quarter of its thickness. 3 things broken and nobody fixed them, so the boy does 5 times the work. Teo sits down without asking. He reties the frayed rope with a fisherman knot he learned in Busan 20 years ago in another life. He finds the fallen counterweight in the weeds and hangs it back. Then he touches the bearing, feels the rust, lets the restoration flow. The drum turns silent and smooth. The boy pulls once and a full bucket rises in 3 seconds. The kid stares with his mouth open. Teo points at the knot. That is a bowline. It holds under load. Remember it. The boy bolts into the village, screaming. By evening, Teo sits in the house of the elder. His name is Bran. Heavy, white hair, a jaw like a shovel blade. 3 fingers gone from his left hand, and no explanation. 1 tallow candle on a table that tilts because 1 leg runs short. Bran sets a lamp between them. Metal base, crystal dome, machined parts gleaming through a seam. Imperial work. Teo knows the quality on sight. This is not village craft. This came from the same civilization whose corpse he walked through that morning. Bran talks, and the language drops into Teo faster than it should, as if the same force that reads broken things also cracks broken speech. The lamp has been dead 40 years. 5 readers of ruins tried. The last took a cow and ran. Teo turns the lamp over, pops the base panel with his thumbnail. Inside, a crystal sits on a copper contact plate. Everyone before him assumed the crystal was dead. The crystal is fine, perfect. The plate beneath it is the problem. Oxidation along a microseam snapped the circuit, a hairline fracture invisible to anyone who does not know where to look. Teo knows. He spent 10 years hunting exactly this failure in museum pieces. The invisible break everyone misses because they stare at the obvious part. He scours the plate with fine sand from his pocket, presses a finger to the fracture, closes it, reassembles the lamp, sets it down. It lights. Warm, steady glow floods the room. No flicker, no sputter. The dark little house turns into something that looks almost like a home. Bran does not move for a long time. He sits in the light and stares at his own hands as if seeing them after years. Then he says it. 40 years we ate dinner in the dark at this table. Something shifts in Teo's chest. Not the restoration sense. Something older. Something human. He says, "Sorry for the delay." That night, Bran calls a meeting. By the end, Teo has a bed, a bowl of hot food, and a new name in this world: the stranger who fixes things. He lies in the dark and listens to night birds that are not birds, and wind through ruins that are not his. And deep in his skull, a faint, stubborn hum. 1,000 broken things calling out at once from the dead city on the hill. He closes his eyes. Tomorrow, he starts with the mill. The mill took him 2 days, not because the work was difficult, but because the mill was broken in 11 places, and each one had to be understood before it could be fixed. The water wheel bearing was cracked. The main axle had warped from decades of uneven load. 6 of the grinding teeth were chipped or missing. The chute was clogged with calcium deposits so thick they had turned into stone. The sluice gate was rusted shut, and the channel feeding water from the river had partially collapsed, burying the intake under a meter of silt. Teo started with the channel because everything else depended on water flow. He spent the first morning on his knees in cold mud, scooping silt by hand, while 3 village men watched him from the bank with the expression of people observing a lunatic. By afternoon, he had cleared the intake and felt along the collapsed wall with his palms. Stone and mortar, simple construction. He understood it completely. He pressed both hands flat and let the restoration move through him. The wall rebuilt itself. Stones slid back into place. Mortar filled the gaps. Water rushed through the cleared channel and hit the sluice gate with a sound like a drum. The 3 men on the bank stopped looking at him like a lunatic. By the end of the second day, the mill wheel was turning. It groaned at first. Then it found its rhythm. A deep, steady rotation that shook the ground under their feet. Grain went in one end, flour came out the other. The village had not had fresh milled flour in over a decade. They had been crushing grain by hand with rocks. An entire generation had grown up thinking that was how flour was made. A woman whose name Teo did not yet know stood watching the flour pour into a wooden trough and pressed both hands over her mouth. Her shoulders shook. Teo wiped mud from his face and pretended not to see, because he was learning that in this world, people cried for things that in his old world would have been ordinary. Running water, a working lamp, flour that was actually fine instead of gritty. These were miracles here, not because they were impossible, but because everyone had forgotten they were possible. After the mill, he fixed 2 plows, straightened the blades, restored the wooden handles where rot had eaten through, rebuilt the iron fittings at the joints. Simple work, barely tiring. The kind of repair he could have done in his sleep at the museum workshop back in Seoul. But the effect was enormous. A plow that cut straight meant a field could be worked in half the time. Half the time in the field meant the other half could be spent on something else. Fixing one thing created space for the next thing. That was the principle he had always believed in. Restoration is not about the object. It is about the chain of life that flows through the object. A lamp is not a lamp. It is the dinner you can finally see. A mill is not a mill. It is the bread your daughter eats tomorrow. By the end of his first week in Mali School, word had spread. Teo did not know how far. He did not know that in this fractured world where nothing worked and nobody could fix anything, a man who could actually repair imperial technology was not just valuable, he was unprecedented. He found out on the 7th morning when a group of armed riders appeared on the ridge above the village. There were 6 of them. Leather armor, short swords, 1 crossbow. The lead rider had a banner pole strapped to his saddle with a crest that Teo did not recognize. A wolf eating a wheel. They rode into the village at a walk, and the villagers scattered like startled birds. Only Bran stayed in the open. He stood in front of his house with the lamp burning on the windowsill behind him, and his 3-fingered hand on a hatchet that would have been useless against any of the 6 riders. The lead rider dismounted and spoke. Teo caught enough to understand. Baron Veckholt sends greetings. The Baron has heard there is a reader in Mali Skoll who performs genuine repairs. The Baron invites this reader to his estate as an honored guest, indefinitely. Bran said something back, short and flat. The writer's face changed. He said something else that was clearly not an invitation anymore. Teo stepped out of the house, where he had been watching through the window. He was holding a wrench he had restored that morning, not as a weapon. He just happened to be holding it. He walked up to the lead rider and looked at his horse. The horse was favoring its left foreleg. Teo crouched down and ran his hand along the hoof. The shoe was badly fitted. 2 nails were bent inward, pressing into the frog of the hoof. The horse had been in low-grade pain for weeks. Teo pulled both nails, straightened them with his fingers, feeling the metal respond to his touch, replaced them at the correct angle. The horse shifted its weight, and for the first time in a month, stood evenly on all 4 legs. Teo looked up at the rider. He said slowly and carefully, "Your Baron can send another invitation when he learns to shoe his own horses. Tell him that for free." The rider stared at him, then at the horse, then back at him. He remounted without a word, and the 6 of them rode out. Bran waited until they were over the ridge. Then he turned to Teo, and his expression was not relieved. It was afraid. He said that Teo needed to leave, not because Bran wanted him gone, but because Baron Veckholt did not send invitations twice. Next time it would be chains. Teo looked at the village, the lamp in Bran's window, the mill turning by the river, the 2 plows leaning against a shed, their blades bright and sharp. A week of work, a week of tiny repairs that had already begun to change lives. He could not stay here and draw a Baron's wrath down on these people. He asked Bran where the nearest city was. Bran said Herod, 3 days south, big enough to hide in, dying slowly because the water tower broke 6 months ago, and nobody could fix it. Teo picked up his pack, such as it was, a blanket, some dried meat, the wrench. He thanked Bran for the hospitality. The old man gripped his arm with his 3-fingered hand and said that if Teo ever came back, there would always be a lamp on for him. Teo walked south. Behind him, the mill wheel turned and turned. Ahead of him, Herod was dying of thirst and did not know yet that help was on its way. Herod smelled before it was visible. Teo caught the scent from half a day's walk out. Stagnant water, open sewage, the particular sweetness of grain rotting in storage because there was not enough clean water to process it. He had smelled something like it once in his old life during a consulting job at a Victorian-era pumping station in rural England. The station had failed, and the town downstream had gone 3 weeks without clean water before the county council got around to sending a repair crew. 3 weeks, and the town was already coming apart. Herod had gone 6 months. The city sat in a shallow valley where 2 rivers met. It should have been an ideal location. Abundant water, natural defenses, good farmland on 3 sides. But the rivers ran brown and silty, and the filtration tower that had once cleaned the city's water supply stood dark and silent on the eastern hill like a dead tooth in a jaw. Teo could feel it from here, not just see it, feel it. That pulling sensation in the back of his skull had been getting stronger the closer he got, and now it was a steady, low ache. The tower was massive, 40 meters tall at least, imperial construction, and it was screaming at him in a language only he could hear. Broken. Fix me. Broken. Fix me. He walked through the city gates unchallenged. There were guards, but they barely looked at him. One was sitting against the wall with the glassy eyes of early plague. The other was watching a cart full of belongings roll out through the gate. Another family leaving. Teo counted the departures as he walked in. 7 carts in one morning. Herod was not just dying, it was emptying. The streets told the story. Buildings in decent repair because stone lasts longer than infrastructure, but the gutters ran with filth because the drainage system was connected to the water tower, and without the tower, the drains had backed up. People carried water in buckets from the river and boiled it over open fires in the streets. The smoke hung low in the valley air. Children had the swollen bellies of bad water. Adults had the haunted look of people who were pretending everything was fine while everything was visibly not fine. Teo found the market square by following the noise. Traders were still operating, but the prices on the board were insane. Clean water cost more than wine. A flask of filtered river water traded for a day's labor. This was how civilizations died. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in the slow, grinding mathematics of a broken pipe. He sat on a low wall near the market and watched and listened. His language comprehension was improving daily. The words came faster now, and the grammar was settling into patterns he could predict. He heard people talking about the water tower. Some said it was cursed. Some said the last engineer who tried to fix it went mad. Some said the city council had sent for a reader of ruins from the capital, and the reader had taken one look at the tower and left the same day. Nobody believed it could be fixed. The tower was imperial technology. Nobody alive understood imperial technology. That was the consensus, and it had hardened into something close to religious doctrine. The tower was broken because the old world was broken, and the old world was broken because that was what the gods intended, and anyone who tried to undo the will of the gods was a fool or a heretic. Teo had heard this kind of thinking before, not in these exact words, but in the same shape. He had seen it in museums where curators refused to restore a damaged painting because the damage was part of its history now. He had seen it in factories where workers refused to learn new techniques because the old way was good enough, even when it clearly was not. The worship of brokenness. The belief that things cannot change because they have not changed. It was the most dangerous form of despair because it dressed itself up as wisdom. He needed 2 things before he could even approach the tower: information and allies. The information came first. He spent 3 days walking the city, asking questions and trading small repairs for answers. He fixed a baker's oven door, restored a cobbler's best knife, straightened a bent cartwheel axle. Each repair took minutes and cost him nothing more than mild fatigue, but each one earned him a conversation. By the end of the 3rd day, he had a rough understanding of the tower's design from descriptions by old-timers who remembered it working. The tower drew water from an underground aquifer through a system of crystal-filtered pipes. The filtration crystals were imperial. The pump mechanism was imperial. The distribution network that fed clean water to every district was imperial. And the whole thing had stopped working 6 months ago when something deep inside the tower had broken with a sound that one witness described as a giant sighing. The second thing he needed walked into his life on the 4th day. He was sitting in a herbalist shop having his wrist bandaged. He had cut it on a rusty pipe while examining the tower's exterior access panel. The herbalist was a woman about his age, with dark circles under her eyes so deep they looked permanent. Her hands were steady and her bandaging was precise, but her supplies were pitiful. 3 jars of dried herbs. A half-empty bottle of alcohol for disinfecting, strips of cloth that had clearly been torn from old clothing and washed too many times. She worked in silence until she was done. Then she looked at him and said that she had heard about the man who was fixing things for free and she wanted to know what the trick was. Teo said there was no trick. She said everyone had a trick. He said her bandaging technique was excellent. She said it was not difficult to bandage wounds when that was all you did every single day because you had no medicines and no equipment, and people kept getting sick from the water, and all you could do was wrap them up and watch them get worse. Her name was Sarah Dolan. Her father had been the city's apothecary before the plague took him. She had inherited his practice and his patience, but not his supplies because those had run out years ago. She was 28 and she looked 40, and she was keeping half of Herod alive through sheer stubbornness and clean bandages. Teo looked at her hands. They were shaking slightly, not from fear, from exhaustion. He said he was going to fix the water tower. She looked at him the way you look at a man who has just told you he plans to fly. He said he meant it. She said that even if he did mean it, what did he want from her? He said he needed someone who knew every sick person in the city and who understood what clean water would change, and who would not lie to him about how bad things really were. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said that things were worse than he thought. 200 people had Gray Plague symptoms. 30 were terminal. Children were dying at a rate of 1 a week. The city council had given up and was quietly negotiating to sell Herod's charter to Baron Veckholt in exchange for a water caravan that would keep the remaining population alive through winter. If that deal went through, Herod would become a barony and its people would become serfs. The water tower was not just infrastructure, it was the city's independence. Teo nodded. Then he said he would also need someone who could fight, because the Baron's men already knew his face, and they would be coming. Sarah said she knew someone, but he would not like her. Sarah was right. He did not like her. Not at first. Yoon Ha-un arrived at the herbalist's shop on the 5th morning in Herod, like a stray cat entering a room. Silent, watchful, ready to leave at the first wrong move. She was young, maybe 24, short dark hair cut with a knife, not scissors. A scar across her left eyebrow that split it in two. She wore leather leggings and a hunter's vest with 12 pockets, and she carried a short recurve bow across her back like it was part of her skeleton. Her hands were calloused in the pattern of someone who drew a bowstring several hundred times a day. She looked at Teo for about 4 seconds and then told Sarah in a flat voice that this was a waste of her time. Sarah said to give him a chance. Yoon said she did not give chances to men who smiled too easily because in her experience, men who smiled too easily were either selling something or hiding something, and either way, she was not buying. Teo stopped smiling. He asked her what she was doing in Herod. She did not answer. Sarah answered for her. Yoon was a former border scout for the Saber Caliphate. She had deserted 2 years ago after receiving orders to burn plague villages with the people still inside them. She had been running ever since. She had arrived in Herod 3 months ago and stayed because it was the kind of place nobody came looking for anyone. She survived by hunting in the hills and trading meat for shelter. She owed Sarah for treating a wound she had gotten in a fight with 2 men who had tried to rob her camp. Sarah had stitched her up without asking questions, and Yoon did not forget debts. That was the only reason she was here, because Sarah asked. Teo said he needed someone to watch his back while he worked on the water tower. The work would take weeks. During that time, he would be exposed and focused and unable to defend himself. He needed eyes and a bow and someone who could read an ambush before it happened. Yoon asked what was in it for her. Teo said clean water. Yoon said she could get clean water from the river if she boiled it. Teo said not for her. For the 200 people in this city with Gray Plague who were drinking poison every day because the tower was broken. Yoon looked at him with an expression he could not read. Then she said, fine. But she was not his friend, and she was not his soldier, and if he turned out to be another liar with clever hands, she would put an arrow in his knee and leave. Teo said that seemed fair. The tower was worse than he expected. He got inside through the exterior access panel on the 6th day. Sarah had arranged for the city council to give him permission. It was not difficult. Nobody else wanted to go in. The interior was dark and the air was thick with the smell of stagnant water and mineral deposits. Teo lit a salvage lamp and began his survey. The tower's architecture was brilliant. Even dead, it was beautiful. A central shaft running the full 40 meters with a spiral system of crystal-filtered chambers arranged around it. Water entered from below through the aquifer tap, rose through the chambers by pressure differential, got filtered at each level by a different crystal array tuned to remove different contaminants, emerged at the top clean and pressurized and fed into the distribution network through a manifold of copper pipes. It was elegant, it was efficient, and it had been built by people who understood water engineering at a level that Teo respected deeply. The problem revealed itself on the third level. One of the crystal arrays had fractured, not from age, from impact. Something had struck it. He found the object embedded in the wall behind the shattered crystal, a crossbow bolt, iron tip, recent, not 200 years old. Someone had shot this crystal deliberately, 6 months ago when the tower stopped working. This was not decay. This was sabotage. Teo sat on the wet stone floor in the dark, holding the bolt and thinking. Who would sabotage a city's water supply? The answer was obvious once he asked the question. Someone who wanted the city desperate enough to sell itself. Someone like Baron Veckholt, or someone working for him. He pocketed the bolt and continued his survey. The sabotaged crystal was the primary failure, but it had caused secondary damage throughout the system. Pressure imbalances had cracked 2 pipes on the upper levels. Mineral buildup had clogged 3 filter chambers that normally self-cleaned when water flowed properly. The aquifer tap valve had seized from disuse. Total count was 14 separate issues. 12 he could fix with his restoration ability. 2 required replacement parts he did not have. The sabotaged crystal was the big one. He could not restore what he did not understand, and he did not understand these crystals yet. They were imperial technology beyond anything he had encountered so far. Complex lattice structures that interacted with water at what seemed like a molecular level. He would need to study them before he could repair them. He came out of the tower at sunset, covered in mineral dust and stinking of old water. Yun was sitting on a rock 20 paces from the entrance with her bow across her knees. She had been there all day. She handed him a water skin without looking at him. He drank and sat down and told her what he had found. The sabotage, the bolt, the scope of the damage. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said one word. Veckholt. He nodded. She said that changed things. If the Baron had sabotaged the tower, then fixing it was not just engineering. It was an act of war against the Baron's interests. Teo said he understood that. She asked if he still wanted to do it. He said the children in this city were dying of contaminated water. She looked at him sideways. Then she said something that surprised him. She said she had a younger sister back in the Caliphate. She had left her behind when she deserted. Not a day passed when she did not think about that. She reached up and touched something hanging on a cord around her neck. A small hair clip. Metal. Bent and tarnished. A child's clip. She did not explain further, and Teo did not ask. She stood up and said she would take the first watch tonight, and that he should sleep because he looked terrible. Teo slept. In his dreams, the tower hummed, and the humming sounded like a voice trying to remember a song it had forgotten. The study took 8 days. 8 days of sitting in the dark belly of the tower with a salvaged lamp and a piece of charcoal and the back of a leather hide that Sarah had given him to use as a drawing surface. Teo mapped every crystal in the array. Their shapes, their internal lattice patterns, the way they were mounted in their housings, and the angles at which they were positioned relative to the water flow. He could not simply touch and restore the broken crystal because he did not yet understand what it was supposed to do at the fundamental level. His ability demanded comprehension. Without it, his hands were just hands. So he learned. He drew diagrams. He compared the broken crystal to the intact ones on other levels. He traced the flow patterns and worked out the filtration logic. Each crystal was tuned to a specific resonance that affected water passing through it. The first level removed sediment. The second removed organic contaminants. The third neutralized mineral toxins. The sabotaged crystal was on the third level, the most critical. Without it, the water was technically clean of mud and bacteria, but still poisonous with mineral compounds that accumulated in the body over weeks. That explained the Gray Plague symptoms, not an actual plague at all, heavy metal poisoning from unfiltered water. Sarah had been treating a water contamination crisis as a disease because nobody alive remembered what the tower actually did. When Teo told her, she sat down hard on a stool and put her face in her hands. She stayed like that for a full minute. Then she looked up, and her eyes were dry and furious, and she said that if the Baron's people had sabotaged the tower knowing what it would do to the population, then this was not politics. This was murder. Teo did not disagree. On the 9th day, he was ready. He had Sarah spread the word quietly, not through the city council, which he did not trust, through her patients, through the women who washed clothes by the river, and the men who hauled water in the morning, and the children who ran messages between districts. By dawn, a crowd had gathered at the base of the tower, not large, maybe 60 people, the ones who still believed that something could change. Teo had asked for help, and this was who showed up. He organized them into teams, one group to carry water for flushing the clogged chambers, one group to hold lamps inside the tower so he could see, one group to stand watch with Yoon outside, in case the Baron's men showed up. He entered the tower and began at the bottom, the aquifer tap valve first. He knelt in a pool of stagnant water and placed both hands on the seized mechanism. Felt the corrosion, understood it, let the restoration flow. The valve opened with a groan, and fresh water surged up from below, cold and dark and heavy with minerals, but moving, alive. He climbed to the first level, cleared the clogged filter chamber by hand first, then restored the cracked pipe with a touch. Second level, same process. Clear, restore, check the flow. Third level, the sabotaged crystal. He had made a replacement housing from copper and clay following the pattern of the intact units. The crystal itself he would have to restore from its fragments. He had spent 2 days collecting every shard from the chamber floor. 47 pieces ranging from the size of his thumb to the size of a grain of rice. He laid them out on a cloth in the order he had determined through 8 days of study. Then he placed his hands over the arrangement and closed his eyes. This was the hardest restoration he had attempted, not because of size, but because of complexity. The crystal's lattice structure was intricate beyond anything in his experience from his old life. This was not ceramics. This was not industrial machinery. This was something that sat at the border between engineering and something else. Something that this world had and his old world did not. He pushed deeper, felt the crystal's memory of itself, its resonance pattern, the way it wanted to vibrate when water flowed through it. He held that pattern in his mind and let his ability do the rest. The fragments moved, slowly at first, then with purpose. They drew together like iron filings to a magnet. Seams closed, cracks vanished, the lattice reformed, and the crystal began to hum. A low, clear tone that Teo felt in his teeth. He opened his eyes. The crystal was whole, blue-white and glowing faintly in the lamplight. He mounted it in the housing and locked it into the array. Then he stepped back and let the water come. It hit the crystal and the hum changed, deepened. The whole tower vibrated. Teo felt it through the soles of his feet and up through his spine and into the base of his skull, where the ache that had been living since he entered Herod suddenly went quiet. The crystal was working. Water passed through it and came out clean on the other side. He could see the difference even in the lamplight. The murky brown became clear. He climbed the 4th level, 5th, checking flow, restoring 2 more minor cracks, tightening seals. By the time he reached the top and opened the manifold valve, he was shaking, not from the cold, from exertion. Every restoration took something from him, and he had done 14 in a single day. His nose was bleeding, his vision was doubling. His hands trembled so badly, he had to use both of them to turn the final valve. The manifold opened, and water entered the distribution network for the first time in 6 months. Somewhere down in the city, a pipe gurgled. Then another. Then a fountain in the market square that had been dry and cracked and used as a garbage dump began to overflow. Teo heard the sound from the top of the tower, a distant roar that was not quite cheering and not quite crying, something in between. Something that 60 people make when they see water coming out of a fountain that they had been told would never work again. He sat down on the cold stone floor at the top of the tower, and the bleeding from his nose dripped onto his shirt, and his vision went gray at the edges, and the last thing he heard before he passed out was the sound of water running through pipes. Clean water. He had heard more dramatic sounds in his life, the crash of a ceiling beam in a museum in Seoul, for instance, but nothing had ever sounded as good as those pipes. He woke in Seta's shop 4 days later. His body felt like it had been taken apart and reassembled by someone who was not paying close attention. Every joint ached. His head throbbed with a pulse that seemed to come from somewhere outside his own skull. Sarah was sitting beside the bed, reading from a stack of papers that he did not recognize. She noticed his eyes open and told him 3 things. First, he had been unconscious for 4 days with a fever that peaked high enough to frighten her. Second, the water tower was still working and every fountain in Herod was running clean. Third, someone had left a trunk on her doorstep 2 days ago, addressed to the man who fixed the tower. No name, no return address, just a heavy wooden trunk with imperial locks. Teo sat up slowly. The room tilted but held. Sarah helped him stand and he looked at the trunk. It was old, very old. The wood was dense and dark. The locks were brass and intricately made and still functional. He touched one and felt it immediately. Imperial work, maybe 300 years old, well maintained. He opened it. Inside were papers, hundreds of pages of dense, handwritten text in a script he could not read. Diagrams, maps, schematics. And on top of everything, a small note in a handwriting that was different from the documents below it. Newer, written in the common trade language that Teo had been learning. The note said, "My father spent his life collecting these. He told me to burn them. I could not. If you are who they say you are, then you will need them more than the fire does." It was signed M. Sarah told him that she had asked around. Mireille Konlevsky found him before he found her. 3 days after he woke from the tower collapse, she appeared at Sarah's shop just before dawn when the streets were still empty. She was small, thin in a way that suggested meals skipped by habit, not by choice. Round wire spectacles sat crooked on her nose because the left arm had been bent and rebent so many times the metal was fatigued almost to breaking. She wore a coat 2 sizes too large that had probably belonged to her father. She stood in the doorway and did not come in, and did not speak, until Teo looked up from the diagrams he was studying and said, "Good morning." Then she said, in a voice so quiet he had to lean forward to hear, that she needed to know one thing before anything else. She needed to know if he was going to use her father's archive to build a weapon. Teo said, no. She said everyone who had ever come looking for imperial knowledge wanted one of 2 things, a weapon or a throne. He said he wanted a water filter. She stared at him. He held up the diagram he had been trying to read. It showed what appeared to be a portable version of the crystal filtration system in the tower. Smaller, simpler, something that could be built for a single household. He said he could see the engineering, but he could not read the annotations. And without the annotations, he did not know the material specifications. She crossed the room and took the paper from his hands and read the annotations in less than 10 seconds. Then she told him the crystal type and the housing dimensions and the flow rate and the expected lifespan of each component, and the name of the imperial engineer who had designed it, and the year it was commissioned, and the factory where it was originally produced. Teo sat back in his chair. She looked at the floor and said she was sorry. She talked too much when she was nervous. He said that was the most useful thing anyone had said to him since he arrived in this world. She did not know what to make of that. Over the next 2 weeks, Meyer became the key that unlocked her father's archive. She could read 4 dead languages, including High Imperial script and Old Temple notation. She could cross-reference documents by date and origin and identify forgeries by ink composition and paper grain. She was not just a translator, she was a scholar in her own right, though she would never have described herself that way. She stammered when more than 3 people were in the room. She avoided eye contact when she spoke. She apologized for existing roughly once an hour. But put a document in front of her and she became someone else entirely. Precise, confident, fast. Teo recognized the transformation because he had seen it in himself. Some people only became whole when they had work in their hands. They worked side by side in the back room of Sarah's shop. Teo would bring questions from his restoration work, and Meyer would dig through the archive for answers. How did the Imperials join copper to crystal without solder? What alloy did they use for pressure seals? What was the formula for the binding agent in their mortar? Each answer opened 10 more questions, and each question led deeper into the archive. After the first week, Mir stopped going home at night. She slept on a cot in the corner with a stack of papers for a pillow. Nobody suggested she leave. She had become essential without anyone noticing the moment it happened. On the 12th day, she told Teo about her father's last request. He had been dying of a slow fever, lung sickness. In his last weeks, he became paranoid. He told her that people were watching, that they wanted the archive, that she had to burn everything before they came. She could not do it. She had grown up in those papers. They were her childhood and her education and the last traces of her father's voice. She hid the trunk instead and lived with the guilt of disobedience ever since. She told this story in a flat voice, looking at the wall, and when she was done, she said she understood if he thought less of her for it. Teo did not answer immediately. He went to the workbench and picked up a project he had been considering for a week. Then he sat down with Mire and said that they were going to do something with the archive that would honor her father and keep the documents safe at the same time. It took them a month, working evenings after the day's restoration tasks were done. Teo and Mire went through the entire archive, page by page. She translated, he organized. Together, they created a new version, a coded reference system that preserved all the technical knowledge, but scrambled the contextual information that could lead enemies to dangerous secrets. They bound it in a new cover. Teo made the cover himself from a piece of her father's old field coat that Mire had kept folded in the bottom of the trunk. He treated the leather and shaped it and restored the cloth where moths had eaten through. The finished codex was beautiful, practical. Word of the water tower spread faster than Teo expected. Within a month of the repair, riders were arriving from settlements 2 and 3 days distant. They came with questions and requests, and sometimes with threats. A farmer from the eastern valleys wanted his irrigation channel rebuilt. A merchant caravan from the coast wanted to hire Teo to restore a cargo of damaged imperial goods. A village headman from the north wanted him to fix a bridge. A representative from Baron Veckholt arrived with a polite letter and 2 armed escorts and a very clear implication that the Baron's patience was not unlimited. Teo fixed the farmer's channel, declined the merchant, agreed to look at the bridge when he had time, and sent the Baron's representative away with a message that politeness was appreciated, but threats wrapped in politeness were still threats. Yoon watched the representative ride off and told Teo that he was collecting enemies faster than friends. Teo said he was aware. She said awareness and survival were not the same thing. She was right. He was beginning to understand that fixing things in this world was not a neutral act. Every repair changed the balance of power. The water tower had transformed Herod from a dying city into a destination. People were moving in instead of out. The market was recovering. The city council was no longer negotiating with Veckholt. And the Baron was losing leverage with every clean glass of water that came out of a Herod fountain. Teo had made an enemy simply by doing his job. The Readers Guild made its first move on a Tuesday. Teo was in the market square repairing a public fountain that had been clogged with calcium deposits. Simple work. 10 minutes. A crowd was watching because crowds always watched now. A man pushed through to the front, middle-aged, well-dressed for Herod, clean hands. He introduced himself as a licensed reader of ruins, representing the guild chapter in the Midland Reach. He said that Teo was operating without guild certification, and that any repairs performed without certification were illegal under the Compact of Trades. He produced a document with seals. Teo did not look at the document. He looked at the man's hands. Clean, no calluses, no tool marks, no oil stains. These were hands that had never repaired anything. He asked the man how many objects he had successfully restored in his career. The man said that was not the point. The point was certification. Teo asked again, how many? The man said the guild's methods were proprietary and results were confidential. Teo turned back to the fountain and finished the repair, and the water ran clean. He told the guild representative that he would be happy to submit to any test the guild wanted to administer, as long as the test involved actually fixing something. The man left, but the message was clear. The guild saw Teo as a threat to their monopoly, and they would use every bureaucratic and political tool available to shut him down. They did not know yet that bureaucracy was the least of what they were willing to use. 2 weeks later, Teo found the sabotage. Not the old sabotage in the water tower, new sabotage. Someone had cracked the main distribution pipe feeding the Eastern District. A clean break, tools marks visible, done at night. The district woke up without water, and the panic was immediate. People flooded the market square, shouting. Some blamed Teo, said his repair was faulty, said the tower was cursed after all. Teo spent the morning fixing the pipe, and the afternoon tracing the tool marks. Yun found boot prints near the break point, military boots, not city guard, not baron's men either. These were lighter, faster, professional. Someone had sent specialists. Sarah reported that a man had been asking questions at the apothecary about Teo's schedule and habits. When she described him, Yun went quiet for a moment, and then said the description matched Caliphate intelligence operatives she had encountered during her service. 3 factions now: the Baron who wanted him caged, the Guild that wanted him discredited, and the Caliphate that wanted to study him. Teo sat in Sarah's shop that night, looking at the crossbow bolt he had kept from the water tower, and the tool marks he had sketched from the new sabotage. And he understood that he could not keep fixing things one at a time in a city that was becoming a target because of him. He needed a place of his own, a defensible position, somewhere he could work without putting others at risk. He asked Mide to find him a map of the region in her father's archive. She found 3, and on the oldest one, drawn in faded imperial ink, was a mark that caught his eye. A fortress on the edge of the old Erin ruins, 3 days northwest of Herod. Its name was Calder. The road to Calder took 4 days, not 3. The old imperial highway had collapsed in sections, and the forest had reclaimed what the highway left behind. Teo walked with a company of 9, himself, Sarah with a pack of medical supplies, Yun scouting ahead with her bow, Meyer carrying the codex in a leather case strapped to her chest like a child, and 5 volunteers from Herod. A blacksmith named Dorvac, who had forearms like tree trunks and had not smiled in the 3 weeks Teo had known him. A carpenter named Liss, who talked constantly and well about wood grain and joinery. 2 former city guards named Polk and Aaron, who had quit the guard when they realized the council was selling the city and wanted to be on the side that was building instead. And a 14-year-old boy named Cal, who had followed them out of the city and refused to go back, and whom Yun had threatened to tie to a tree, but ultimately allowed to stay because he could climb anything and fit into spaces adults could not. They reached Calder on the evening of the 4th day, and Teo stood at the edge of the tree line and looked at it and felt his breath leave him. It was enormous. Not a castle, a fortress workshop. The Imperials had built it as a maintenance station for the Northern Infrastructure Network. 4 walls of black basalt, 2 towers still standing, 1 collapsed into rubble. A central courtyard 200 paces across, and inside the walls, buildings, workshops, storage halls. What had been a forge complex with 3 chimneys still pointing at the sky. barracks, a well house, and in the center of the courtyard, a stone platform that hummed so loudly in Teo's skull that he had to sit down. The place was broken. Massively, comprehensively. 200 years of weather and neglect and occasional looting had taken everything that was not stone. But the stone remained. And the stone was imperial, built to last 1,000 years and only halfway through. Teo touched the outer wall, felt it. The wall remembered what it was supposed to be. It wanted to be whole. He could feel every crack and every missing stone and every point where roots had pushed through mortar. He could feel the entire fortress like a body on a table waiting for the surgeon. He pulled his hand away. Not yet. This would take planning. This would take months. But it could be done. He turned to his company of 9 tired people standing in the failing light and said, "This is home." Nobody argued. They slept in the least damaged building, a storage hall with 3 walls intact and half a roof. Teo spent the first morning surveying, not restoring, surveying. He walked every room and every corridor and every collapsed passage with Meyer beside him taking notes. They cataloged damage, prioritized repairs, made lists. The well house first, because water was life. Then the forge, because tools were next. Then one barracks building, because people needed shelter. Then the walls, because enemies would come eventually. The well was dry, not because the aquifer was gone, but because the pump mechanism had seized. Same principle as the tower in Herod, but simpler. A mechanical pump driven by a counterweight system. Teo fixed it on the second day. Water rose from the darkness below, clean and cold and tasting of mineral. They had water. Dorvac the blacksmith wept. He had not smiled, but he wept freely and without shame. And then he wiped his face and said, "Show me the forge." The forge took a week. Teo restored the main hearth and the bellows mechanism and the anvil mount. The anvil itself was missing, looted decades ago, but the mount was there, and when Dorvac found a boulder of suitable density and shape in the rubble, Teo helped him seat it and secure it, and it was not an imperial anvil, but it would do. Dorvac lit the first fire in that forge in 200 years, and the smoke rose from the chimney, and Yoon, who was on the wall doing a perimeter sweep, saw it against the sky and for a moment stood still watching. Smoke from a chimney meant someone was making something. Smoke from a chimney meant home. She did not say this to anyone, but Teo saw her face when she came down from the wall, and he understood. The 12th person to arrive at Calder was not a refugee. She came over the north wall at 2 in the morning, and Yoon almost put an arrow through her throat. The only reason she did not was that the intruder made no attempt to hide. She landed on the courtyard stones and stood up with her hands visible and said loudly that she would appreciate not being shot because she had walked for 6 days to get here, and dying now would be annoying. Yoon kept the arrow drawn. Teo came out of the barracks barefoot and squinting. The intruder was young, 19 at most, short, broad-shouldered for her frame. Her hands were wrapped in dirty bandages from the wrists to the fingertips. She wore men's trousers and a leather vest over a linen shirt with burn marks on both sleeves. Her hair was cut shorter than Yoon's, and she had a bruise on her jaw that was 3 days old and yellowing. She looked at Teo and said, "You are the one who fixes things." He said yes. She said, "Good." She needed a job. Her name was Ashley Brandt. She had been a servant in Baron Veckholt's workshop, not a craftswoman. Servants were not allowed to be craftswomen. But she had watched the Baron's engineers work for 4 years, and at night, when the workshop was empty, she had taught herself. Metalwork, gear assemblies, basic pneumatics. She learned by touch and by theft, stealing minutes with tools that were not hers and books that were not meant for her. When the head engineer caught her adjusting a lathe, she had been beaten and locked in the cellar for 2 days. When she got out, she stole a set of calipers and a hammer and ran. That was 3 weeks ago. She had been living in the forest since then, surviving on raw roots and stubbornness. She heard about Calder from a trader on the road and came. Teo looked at her hands. The bandages were filthy, and when Sarah unwound them an hour later, the damage was extensive. Burns from working metal without proper protection. Old burns layered over new ones. Scars that had healed badly because nobody had treated them. The skin on her palms was a map of years of secret, unsupervised, dangerous work done in stolen moments by a girl who loved machines and had no one to teach her safely. Sarah cleaned and rebandaged the hands without comment. Her silence was louder than any lecture. Teo asked Ashley to show him what she could do. She asked for a broken mechanism, any mechanism. He gave her a seized door hinge from the barracks, imperial, corroded, complicated by a locking pin mechanism that most people would not even notice. Ashley turned it over in her bandaged hands for 30 seconds. Then she described its function correctly. Not just what it did, but how. The pin engages on the third rotation and locks the hinge at 45 degrees for defensive positioning. She had never seen an imperial hinge before. She had deduced the engineering from the shape alone. Teo looked at Dorvac. Dorvac looked at Teo. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. This girl was not a servant who had learned a few tricks. This girl was a natural engineer who had been locked in a cellar for touching a lathe. Teo told her she had a job. She could start in the forge with Dorvac in the morning. She nodded and her face did not change. She had been expecting to have to argue for it. She had not expected yes. 3 days later, Teo was in the forge watching Ashley work. She was fast. Rough, but fast. Her instincts were correct, but her technique was self-taught and full of gaps and bad habits that would eventually cost her fingers. Dorvac was already correcting her grip and her hammer angle, and she was absorbing the corrections without resistance, which told Teo that she had been waiting for someone to teach her properly for years. He noticed her gloves. She did not have any. She was working barehanded, with the fresh bandages Sarah had applied already showing scorch marks. He left the forge without saying anything. He went to the leather store and spent the evening working. He had found a supply of imperial-grade leather in one of the storage rooms, thin but incredibly heat-resistant, reinforced with a thread that Meyer identified from the archive as fireproof imperial weave. He cut the leather to the shape of Ashley's hands, not generic workshop gloves, her hands specifically. He had watched her work and knew the proportions, the width of her palm, the length of each finger, the way her grip naturally formed around a hammer handle. He stitched the gloves with the imperial thread, reinforced the knuckles and the fingertips where heat contact was most frequent. On the cuff of the right glove, he embossed her initials, A, B, small, precise, hers. He left them on her workbench before she arrived in the morning. He was in the courtyard repairing a wall section when he heard a sound from the forge. Not a scream, not laughter. A choked noise that lasted about 2 seconds and then stopped. He did not go to look. When Ashley came out to the courtyard an hour later, she was wearing the gloves. She wore them for the rest of the day. She wore them to dinner. She wore them to bed. Dorvac told Teo quietly that evening that the girl had cried for exactly 5 seconds and then gone back to work with a focus he had not seen in an apprentice in 30 years. Teo nodded. He understood. Some people had never owned anything that was made for them. The first time it happened, it broke something open, and something new grew in the space. By the 3rd month, Calder held 43 people. The growth was not dramatic. It was steady, one family at a time. A couple from Herod who had heard about clean water and a working forge. A group of refugees from the northern villages where the second wave of plague was creeping south. An old mason and his grandson who had nowhere else to go. A former soldier who had deserted from the Midland militia and wanted to build instead of burn. They came because Calder had 4 things that almost nowhere else in the Midland Reach could offer. Clean water, a working forge, walls that were getting stronger every week, and a man who could fix what was broken. Teo organized them the way he had organized restoration teams in his old life, not by rank but by skill. Dorvac ran the forge with Ashley as his second. Sarah ran the infirmary, which was now a cleaned and restored room in the old barracks, with actual shelves and actual supplies traded for with Herod merchants. Yoon ran security, which meant she trained 6 volunteers in basic patrol and watch rotation, and scared them so thoroughly that nobody ever missed a shift. Meyer ran the archive and the school. The school was Teo's idea, 2 evenings a week in the old records office. He taught basic engineering principles, how to read a diagram, how to identify load-bearing structures, how to spot the difference between a crack from settling and a crack from stress. Simple things, fundamental things, things that in his old world were taught in first-year university courses and in this world had been lost for 200 years. The classes were small at first, Ashley and Dorvac and 3 of the newer arrivals. By the second month, Cal, the 14-year-old climber, was attending every session and asking questions that made Mireille look up from her translations with raised eyebrows. The first real test came from the priests. Teo had heard of the Grey Repose cult, but had not encountered them directly until a delegation of 3 arrived at Calder's gate on a gray morning in early autumn. They wore undyed robes and ash marks on their foreheads, and they spoke with the particular calm of people who believed that calmness was a moral achievement. Their leader was a tall woman named Sister Vela, who had a voice like a funeral bell, pleasant, resonant, designed to make you feel that disagreement was not just wrong, but unkind. She said that the Grey Repose had been watching Calder's growth with concern. She said that the restoration of imperial technology was a violation of the natural order. The Great Crash had been a correction, a necessary humbling of human arrogance. The Shining Empire had reached too high, and the world had answered with fire and plague. To rebuild what the world had torn down was to repeat the sin that caused the fall. She said this with genuine sadness, as if she pitied Teo for not understanding. Teo listened. He did not interrupt. When she was done, he asked her one question. He asked if the Grey Repose used fire for cooking. She said, of course. He asked if fire was a technology. She said it was a gift from the natural world. He said that every technology started as a gift from the natural world. Stone tools, bronze casting, water filtration. The only difference between fire and an imperial water tower was complexity. If fire was acceptable, then where was the line, and who got to draw it? Sister Vela smiled and said that wisdom drew the line. Teo said that a child in Herod had died last month from drinking contaminated water, because the line had been drawn before the water tower was fixed. He asked if that death was wisdom. She did not answer. She and her delegation left the same day. But Teo knew this was not over. The Grey Repose had thousands of followers across the Midland Reach. They ran the only functioning charitable network in the region. Hospitals, soup kitchens, orphanages, all built on the doctrine that humanity should accept its decline with grace. Teo was threatening not just their theology, but their purpose. A world that could be fixed did not need priests who taught you how to die. The second test was quieter and more dangerous. Teo had been working on the irrigation system. The fields around Calder had been imperial farmland once. The archive showed a network of small agricultural golems, mechanical workers powered by crystal batteries that could plow and plant and harvest with minimal human oversight. The golems were gone, destroyed or looted or simply broken down over 2 centuries. But the infrastructure remained. Crystal charging stations, guidance tracks embedded in the soil, maintenance ports at the field edges. Teo had been studying the system for weeks, and he believed he could restore one golem if he could find one intact enough to work with. Yun found it. Half buried in a collapsed shed a quarter mile from the fortress wall, a humanoid frame about 4 feet tall, 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso housing for the crystal battery, a head that was mostly a sensor array for navigating the guidance tracks. It was badly damaged. 1 arm was missing. The legs were fused together by corrosion. The crystal housing was cracked, but the core structure was sound. Teo had it brought to the courtyard and spent a week studying it. Mire found the technical manual in the archive. Ashley fabricated a replacement arm from forge iron following Teo's specifications. Dorvac cast a new crystal housing from bronze. The crystal itself, Teo would have to restore from the cracked original. He worked on it for 3 days, feeling the lattice, understanding the energy patterns. This crystal was different from the water tower ones. It stored power rather than filtering water. The principle was similar, but the application was more complex. On the fourth day, he placed both hands on the golem's chest and pushed everything he had into it. He felt the restoration take hold. The golem changed everything. Not because it was powerful. It was a farm worker, 4 feet tall with stubby arms designed for pulling weeds and turning soil. It could not fight. It could not build. It shuffled along the ancient guidance tracks at the speed of a slow walk and made a soft clicking sound with every step, like a metronome keeping time for the earth. But the effect on the people of Calder was seismic. 43 people stood in the courtyard that first morning, watching the golem walk to the field edge and lower its arms into the soil and begin to turn it. Rows appeared behind it, straight and even and perfectly spaced. Work that would take 3 men a full day was done in 2 hours by a machine that did not tire and did not complain and did not need to eat. Old Polk, the former city guard, sat down on a stone and stared at the field for a long time. Then he said quietly that his grandfather used to tell stories about golems working the fields when he was a boy. He said his grandfather had been called a liar and a drunk for telling those stories. He said his grandfather died believing his own memories were fantasies. The golem turned another row. Polk wiped his face with his sleeve and went to help Dorvac in the forge and did not mention it again. But Teo noticed that he worked harder that day than any day before. A man whose grandfather's stories had just been proven true tended to work with a particular kind of fury. The harvest came 6 weeks later. The golem had prepared and planted 3 acres of winter wheat, using seed stock that Sarah had traded for in Herod. The yield was not spectacular by imperial standards, but by the standards of a world where most fields were worked by hand with bent tools on exhausted soil, it was extraordinary. 3 acres produced enough grain to feed Calder through winter, with surplus to trade. Teo stood at the edge of the field on harvest day, watching people cut wheat with restored sickles, and he did the math in his head. 1 golem, 3 acres, 43 people fed. If he could restore 5 golems, he could feed 200. 10 golems, and the entire region around Calder would never go hungry again. The bottleneck was crystals. Each golem needed a power crystal, and each crystal required days of focused restoration work that left him bedridden afterward. He could not scale by himself. He needed to find another way. He needed to teach. That was when the idea of the school shifted from evening lectures to something more serious. Teo sat down with Mir and the archive and spent 3 days designing a curriculum. Not magic, not his restoration ability. That could not be taught because it was not a skill. It was something else, something tied to whoever he was in this world and how he had arrived here. But the knowledge underneath it, that could be shared. Metallurgy, material science, structural analysis, crystal theory as documented in the imperial texts. The principles of how things work and why they break and what it takes to fix them. He started with Ashley because she was the fastest learner. He gave her a cracked gear assembly and asked her to diagnose the failure without touching it, just looking. She circled it for 10 minutes. Then she said the crack started at the tooth root on the drive side. Stress concentration from a manufacturing defect. The gear had been cast with an air bubble trapped at the root, and over years of use, the bubble became a crack, and the crack became failure. She was right. Teo had her explain her reasoning to Dorvac and Cal and 2 other students. Then he had them practice on other broken components. Find the origin of the failure, understand the sequence, trace the damage backward from result to cause. It was the fundamental skill of restoration, and it did not require any supernatural ability. It required eyes and patience and the willingness to look at broken things long enough to understand them. Within a month, he had 6 students who could diagnose common mechanical failures. Within 2 months, Ashley was performing simple repairs on her own, not with Teo's ability, with tools and knowledge and her own 2 scarred hands. The first time she fixed a seized pump mechanism without any help, she stood up from the workbench and looked at her gloves. the gloves he had made for her. Then she looked at Teo across the workshop, and her jaw was tight, and her eyes were bright, and she nodded once. He nodded back. That was enough. Autumn deepened, and the nights grew cold, and the fortress walls grew stronger. Teo had restored 2 more sections of the outer wall, and the main gate mechanism. The gate was imperial engineering at its finest. A counterweighted system that allowed a single person to open or close a door that weighed 3 tons. When Teo restored it and the gate swung shut for the first time, with that distinctive imperial click, the sound echoed off the courtyard walls, and everyone stopped what they were doing. That click was the sound of safety, the sound of a door that could not be kicked in. Yoon tested it by throwing herself against it at full speed and bouncing off and saying "good" while rubbing her shoulder. She had been drilling the volunteers harder in recent weeks, running patrols wider, setting watchfires on the hilltops. She would not say why, but Teo could read the tension in her movements. Something was coming. She could feel it, the way he could feel broken things. She could feel threat. One night, she came to him after the others had gone to sleep. She was holding her sister's hair clip, the bent and tarnished one she wore on a cord around her neck. She held it out to him without explanation. He took it, turned it in his fingers, felt it. The metal was cheap, tin alloy, badly made to begin with, but someone had scratched a design into the surface with a knife tip. Tiny, crude. A pattern of stars that a child had carved with serious concentration. The scratches were almost gone, worn smooth by years of handling. Teo worked on it for an hour at the kitchen table, while Yoon sat across from him and watched without speaking. He cleaned the corrosion, straightened the bend, restored the metal to its original shape. And then he went further. Winter came hard that first year. Snow buried the fields, and ice sealed the well for 3 days before Teo figured out how to restore the pump's thermal jacket to keep it from freezing. The fortress walls held the wind, but the cold came through the stone like a lift. Teo checked her progress every evening and corrected less and less each time. She was learning at a speed that frightened him slightly because it reminded him that genius without opportunity was the most common tragedy in any world. On the coldest night of the year, a girl walked through the gate. She was maybe 10, thin enough that the shape of her skull was visible through her skin. She carried nothing except a cloth bundle pressed against her chest. She walked to the center of the courtyard and stopped and stood there in the snow, shaking. Cal found her during his watch round and brought her to the forge. Sarah took one look and started working. Hypothermia, malnutrition, and something else. A faint gray tinge to the skin around her temples. Early gray plague. But not the contaminated water kind they had seen in Herod. This was the real thing. The mana-borne sickness that had been creeping south from the northern wastes for months. Sarah worked through the night. By morning, the girl was stable, but the gray tinge had not faded. Sarah told Teo privately that she had seen this progression before. Without imperial medicine, the girl had maybe 3 months. The girl's name was Lila Song. She did not say where she came from or how she had traveled alone in winter at her age. She said only one thing that first day. She said that something inside her hurt. Not her stomach, not her head. Inside her chest. Like something was stuck there. Teo knelt beside her cot and placed his hand near her sternum and felt it immediately. A jolt that went up his arm and into his skull like touching a live wire. He pulled back, looked at Sarah, looked at Meyer who had come in with a lamp. Then he said very carefully that there was something in this girl's chest that was not supposed to be there. A crystal. A fragment of something. Embedded deep. He could feel it humming at a frequency that made his teeth ache. Imperial. Old. And slowly killing her. Meyer went pale. She said that the archive mentioned cases of crystal contamination. Imperial workers who had accidents with raw crystal. The shards would embed in flesh, and the body could not reject them because the crystal was not inert. It was active. It drew mana from the host. Slowly. Permanently. Until the host was empty. There was a treatment. but it required a functioning medicinal altar. One of the great imperial healing devices that combined crystal resonance with herbal medicine to perform what this world called miracles, and Teo's world would have called targeted molecular therapy. He did not have a medicinal altar. The nearest documented one was in the ruins of Old Erin, 3 days away, in the dead city where Teo had first woken up in this world, where the pulling in his skull had been so loud he could barely think. Lila looked up at him from her cot, with eyes that were too old for her face. She asked if he could fix it. He said he would try. She nodded as if that was sufficient. Then she opened her cloth bundle and showed him what she had been carrying. A clay bird. Small, brown, crude. One wing was broken off, and the beak was chipped, and the tail had crumbled to a nub. She said her mother made it for her. Before. She did not say before what. She asked if he could fix this too. Teo took the bird and held it, and felt the clay and the fingerprints of a woman he would never meet pressed into its surface. He said yes, he could fix this. Teo split his forces. It was not a military term, and he did not think of it that way, but that was what it was. Yoon would stay at Calder with Dorvac and the volunteers and prepare the fortress for siege. Ashley would finish the second golem and begin reinforcing the gate mechanism with additional bracing. Sarah would stabilize Lila as long as possible, and Teo would go to Old Erin with Meyer to find the medicinal altar. 3 days there, 3 days back. Whatever time he needed inside the ruins to locate and restore the altar. He calculated 12 days minimum. That left 18 before the Baron's deadline. It was tight. Everything was always tight. He left before dawn with Meyer and a pack of supplies and a borrowed sword he did not know how to use. Yoon pressed the sword into his hands and said that if he encountered anything hostile, he should swing the sharp end forward and try not to die. Then she said something else, quietly, so only he could hear. She said, "Come back." Not as an order, as something she did not have another word for. He nodded and walked into the dark. Old Erin was worse the second time. The pulling in his skull started from a day's walk out, and by the time they reached the outer ruins, it was a constant roar. Every stone screamed at him, every collapsed wall, every shattered window. The entire city was a wound, and his ability could feel every inch of it. Mir watched him stumble and steadied his arm and asked if he could manage. He said he had no choice. They entered through the same gap in the wall he had used months ago. The streets were as he remembered, overgrown, silent, full of ghosts that were not ghosts, but just the memory of a city that had been alive and was not anymore. Mir navigated using a map from the archive. The medicinal altar had been located in the central district, the Hall of Mending, a dedicated imperial medical facility that had served the capital's population of 300,000. 300,000 people with clean water and working medicine and lights that turned on when you wanted them to. All gone in a single night. Teo tried not to think about it. He focused on the map and the path and the throbbing in his head that was getting louder with every block they crossed. They reached the Hall of Mending at midday on the second day inside the city. The building was still standing, mostly. The roof had collapsed in the eastern wing, but the central chamber was intact, sealed behind a door of imperial alloy that had not corroded in 200 years. Teo placed his hand on the door and felt it. The lock mechanism was functional. The door was not broken. It was locked. Deliberately. Someone had sealed this building before the end. He found the lock, a crystal-encoded system that required a specific resonance pattern to open. He could feel the pattern in the mechanism's memory. He matched it. The door opened with a sound like a sigh. Inside was dark and dry, and the air tasted of dust and old stone and something else. Something clean. Like the smell after rain in a place where it had not rained in 2 centuries. The altar was in the center of the chamber, a raised platform of white stone with crystal arrays mounted at 6 points around its perimeter. Channels cut into the stone surface in patterns that Meyer immediately began sketching. Shelves along the walls held hundreds of small jars. Some were shattered. Some were intact. Imperial medicines. preserved by the sealed environment for 200 years. Sarah would have wept. Teo would bring her back here. But first, the altar. He surveyed it for 6 hours. Mireille translated inscriptions on the base, while he traced the crystal arrays and the channel patterns and the mounting hardware. The altar was damaged, but not destroyed. 3 of the 6 crystals were cracked. The stone channels had mineral deposits blocking flow at several points. 2 of the mounting brackets had shifted from the earthquake that must have accompanied the Great Crash. But the core was intact. The fundamental design was sound. This machine had been built to heal people, and it still wanted to heal people. He could feel it. That same yearning he felt in every broken thing, but stronger here. Desperate almost, as if 200 years of silence had made the desire to function unbearable. He began work at dawn on the 3rd day, cleared the channels first, restored the mounting brackets, then the crystals, one at a time. Each one required him to understand its specific function in the healing process. The first crystal was diagnostic. It read the patient's body. The second was analytic. It identified the problem. The third was preparatory. It mixed the appropriate compounds from the stored medicines. He worked for 14 hours straight. Mir fed him bread and water without him asking. She had learned to read his work patterns. When his hands shook, she gave him water. When his nose bled, she handed him cloth and said nothing. When he swayed on his feet, she put a hand on his back, not pushing, just present, a reminder that he was not alone. By nightfall, he had restored 5 of 6 crystals. The last one was the most complex, the healing crystal itself, the one that actually performed the treatment. It was not just cracked, it was shattered into dozens of pieces, like the crystal in Herod's water tower, but more intricate by an order of magnitude. This crystal did not just filter, it rebuilt, repaired living tissue at the cellular level. The irony was not lost on him. A machine that healed people, built by a civilization that had destroyed itself. They made it back in 2 days instead of 3 because Mir found a shorter route through a mountain pass that the archive map marked as an imperial supply road. The road was overgrown, but the paving stones were still there under the dirt, and Teo's feet found them by instinct. Imperial roads were built to last, and even buried, they were smoother than any path in the modern world. He was weak. The altar restoration had cost him more than anything he had done before. His hands trembled. His vision doubled when he turned his head too fast. Blood had crusted in his left ear, and he could not hear properly on that side. Meyer walked beside him, carrying both their packs, and did not complain. She had not complained once during the entire journey. She had a strength that had nothing to do with muscle. It was the strength of someone who had spent her whole life being underestimated and had stopped caring about it. They saw the smoke from half a day out. Not forge smoke, not cooking smoke, black smoke. The kind that comes from things burning that should not be burning. Teo started running, and his body screamed at him, and he ran anyway. They crested the last ridge as the sun was setting and looked down at Calder, and his stomach dropped. The fortress was surrounded. Not 400 men, more. The Baron had brought everyone. Tents circled the walls in a ragged arc. Cook fires dotted the perimeter. 2 siege engines stood assembled on the eastern approach, crude but functional, battering rams on wooden frames. The main gate was holding, but the western wall had a breach. He could see where stones had been knocked inward by repeated impacts. The breach was plugged with timber and debris. Yoon's work. She had prepared. But the numbers were overwhelming. Teo counted banners, Vekholt's wolf-eating wheel, the guild's silver compass, and a third banner he did not recognize, dark red with a black circle. Meyer saw it and grabbed his arm. Her fingers dug in hard enough to leave marks. She said that was the Ash Seal, the Order of Ash. Teo had heard the name. Meyer had mentioned them in passing during their work on the archive. A secret organization dedicated to ensuring the Shining Empire never rose again. Their presence here meant this was not just a baron's land grab or a guild's business dispute. This was ideological. They had come to destroy what Teo was building because what Teo was building represented everything they had spent 2 centuries preventing. He could not enter through the gate. The approach was covered by crossbowmen. Meyer led him to a drainage tunnel on the northern slope that the archive map showed connecting to Calder's underground water system. They crawled through 300 meters of dark, wet stone and emerged in the well house. Yoon was waiting. She had seen them on the ridge. She looked at Teo and said he looked terrible. He said he felt terrible. She said the siege had begun 4 days ago. 2 assaults on the gate, 1 on the western wall, both repelled, 12 defenders wounded, none dead yet. Ashley's second golem was operational and had been used to shore up the breach by carrying stones too heavy for humans. Dorvac had armed every person who could hold a weapon. Sarah was in the infirmary with the wounded and with Lila, who was getting worse. The gray tinge had spread from her temples to her cheeks. She had maybe 2 weeks now, maybe less. Teo closed his eyes for 3 seconds. Then he opened them and said he needed to see the courtyard. The courtyard was where he had first felt the stone platform humming, the old imperial resonator plate buried under 2 inches of dirt and debris. He had known it was there since the first day. He had not understood it. He had not been ready. But 3 days in the Hall of Mending, studying imperial crystal technology at its most sophisticated, had changed something in his comprehension. He understood resonance now. He understood how the Imperials had built their structures not as collections of individual stones, but as integrated systems. Every wall connected to every other wall, every foundation linked to the platform beneath. Calder was not a fortress made of parts. It was a single machine that had been turned off for 200 years. And the resonator plate in the courtyard was its heart. He told Yun to pull everyone inside the inner buildings. He told Ashley to position both golems at the breach. He told Dorvac to bank the forge fire because what he was about to do might shake the building. He told Meyer to stand at the edge of the courtyard and document everything she saw, because if this worked, someone would need to understand how to do it again without him. Then he knelt on the stone plate in the center of the courtyard and placed both palms flat on its surface. The humming rose, through his hands, through his arms, through his chest and his spine, and into the base of his skull where it had always lived. He felt Calder, all of it. Every stone, every wall, every tower, every crack and breach and missing piece. The fortress was a body, and it was broken, and it was asking him to make it whole. He had never attempted anything this large. The water tower in Herod had been one structure. This was an entire complex. Walls, towers, buildings, gates, underground passages, the resonator plate itself, all connected, all part of the original imperial design, all wanting to return to what they had been. He pushed. The effort hit him like a physical blow. His vision went white. His nose erupted. Blood ran down his chin and onto the stone, and the stone drank it, or maybe that was his imagination. He pushed harder, felt the walls respond, stone grinding against stone as cracks sealed and breaches closed, and missing blocks reformed from the rubble at the base of the walls. The western breach shut like a mouth closing. The collapsed tower on the south side groaned and began to rise, stones lifting from the debris field and stacking themselves with geometric precision, mortar flowing between them like liquid. The main gate strengthened, reinforced itself. The imperial click of its locking mechanism echoed across the courtyard. And the tower. The tall tower on the northeast corner. The one with the crystal housing at its peak that Meyer had identified in the archive as a signal beacon, a lighthouse. It rebuilt itself stone by stone, and the crystal at its peak caught the last light of sunset and amplified it, and a beam of white light shot into the darkening sky so bright that Teo could see it through his closed eyelids. Outside the walls, the besieging army saw a fortress that had been crumbling for 2 centuries suddenly become whole. Walls that had been cracking under their siege engines were now smooth and seamless, and 10 feet higher than they had been that morning. A tower of white light rose above them like a pillar holding up the sky. The light was visible from 10 miles in every direction. He slept for 6 days. Sarah said later that his heart had stopped twice during the first night, and she had brought him back both times with chest compressions and language that she would not repeat in polite company. The second time his heart stopped, she had hit him so hard in the sternum that she bruised her own fist. And when he gasped back to life, she sat on the floor beside his cot and shook for 20 minutes without making a sound. She did not tell him this. Dorvac told him 3 weeks later over a cup of bad ale, and even then he told it like a joke, because that was how Dorvac handled things that frightened him. But in those 6 days, while Teo was somewhere between alive and not, the fortress held its breath. Yoon doubled the watch rotation, not because she expected another attack, but because people needed something to do with their hands while they waited. Ashley did not leave the forge for 4 days straight. She built things, small things, hinges and brackets and nail sets, things nobody had asked for. Things she made because the alternative was sitting still, and she could not sit still while the man who had given her gloves was dying in the next building. Meyer read. She sat in the library she had organized in the restored records hall, and she read every medical text in her father's archive, looking for something that might help, and finding nothing. Because Teo's condition was not in any book. He had not been injured. He had not been poisoned. He had simply given more of himself than a body was designed to give. And the debt was being collected in ways that medicine could not address. Cal climbed. He went up the restored walls every morning and sat on the beacon tower and watched the horizon as if expecting something to appear that would fix everything. He was 14. He still believed that solutions arrived from the horizon if you watched hard enough. On the 3rd day, Sarah noticed something. Teo's hands were warm. Not fever warm, warm in a way that had nothing to do with his body temperature. She held his wrist to check his pulse and felt heat radiating from his palms like stones that had been sitting in sunlight. She pulled back the blanket and looked at his hands and saw that the skin was faintly luminous, not glowing, not bright enough to see in daylight, but in the dim infirmary with the shutters closed, there was a soft warmth coming from his fingers that had not been there before. She did not tell anyone. She sat beside him and watched. And on the 4th day, the luminosity faded, and his hands were just hands again. But she remembered. And weeks later, when Teo described the feeling of the resonator plate connecting to the fortress through his body, she thought about those 3 days of warm hands and understood something she could not articulate. The restoration of Calder had changed him. Not just tired him. Changed the way water changes the shape of a riverbed. The channel was the same, but the depth was different. When he opened his eyes on the 6th day, the first thing he saw was the ceiling. Smooth imperial stone. Not a single crack. Not a single patch. Seamless construction that had been designed to last a millennium and had been broken for 2 centuries and was now whole again because he had knelt on a stone plate and asked it to remember what it was. He stared at the ceiling for a long time. He counted the stone blocks. 47 in his field of vision. Each one precisely cut. Each one fitted to its neighbor with joints so fine that a blade could not fit between them. Imperial masonry at its finest. He had restored this, not just patched it, returned it to the exact condition its builders had intended. And it had nearly killed him. He turned his head. The movement sent pain down his neck and into his spine like a wire being pulled through his vertebrae. Lila was in the next bed. She was asleep. Her breathing was shallow and uneven, with long pauses between breaths that made his chest tighten every time they happened. The gray tinge that had been at her temples when she first arrived at Calder had spread. It covered her neck now, crept along her jaw, touched the edges of her cheeks like frost spreading across a window. The crystal in her chest was winning. It was drawing the life from her 1 day at a time, and there was nothing in Calder that could stop it. The clay bird was still in her hand, clutched against her sternum directly above the place where the shard was embedded, as if some instinct told her to protect that spot, or as if the bird was standing guard. He had not fixed it yet. He had promised her, in the forge, on that cold night when she first showed it to him. He had said yes, he could fix this. And then he had gone to war instead, and the bird was still broken, and the girl was still dying, and his promises were stacking up faster than his body could cash them. He sat up. The room tilted, steadied, tilted again. He waited, breathed. The air tasted of dried herbs and clean stone, and something metallic that he realized was his own blood, dried, old, on his upper lip and in the creases beside his nose. He wiped it with the back of his hand, and the flakes came away brown. 6 days of blood drying on his face while he slept. Sarah appeared in the doorway. She had not been far. He would learn later that she had not been more than 30 steps from the infirmary for the entire 6 days. She had slept on a chair in the corridor, eaten standing up, checked his pulse every 2 hours through the night. Her eyes had the look he was beginning to recognize as her permanent state. Dark circles so deep they looked like bruises, skin pale from insufficient sleep, hands steady despite everything because her hands were always steady. That was the thing about Sarah. The rest of her could be falling apart, and her hands would still wrap a bandage perfectly. She told him to lie down. He said he needed to fix Lila's bird. She stopped in the doorway. Her expression shifted through several things in rapid succession: frustration, exhaustion, something that might have been anger. And underneath all of it, a softness that she would have denied if he had pointed it out. She said the girl was dying, and he was worried about a clay toy. He said, yes. She looked at him for a long time, the kind of look that was not really looking at him, but looking at something behind him, or beyond him, or inside him that she was trying to understand. Then she crossed to Lila's bed and gently, so gently, eased the bird from the sleeping girl's fingers. Lila's hand twitched, but did not wake. Sarah brought the bird to Teo and placed it in his palms and said nothing else. She sat down on the chair beside his bed and folded her arms and watched him work. He held the bird. It was small, smaller than his palm. Brown clay fired unevenly so that one side was darker than the other. The kind of thing made in a kitchen hearth, not a kiln. One wing was broken off cleanly at the shoulder. The beak was chipped. The tail had crumbled to a rounded nub that bore no resemblance to the fan shape it had once been. And the surface was covered in fingerprints. Not his, not Lila's. Her mother's. Pressed into wet clay by hands that had shaped this bird with more love than skill. Teo closed his eyes and let his ability reach into the clay. He felt the bird's history, not as images or memories, but as a physical record written in the material itself. The clay had been dug from a riverbank. He could feel the river in it, cool and mineral-rich. It had been kneaded on a wooden table. He could feel the grain of the wood transferred to the clay's surface. It had been shaped by fingers that pressed too hard in some places and too soft in others. The left wing was thicker than the right because the maker was right-handed, and the right hand pressed with more confidence. The beak had been formed with a thumbnail, one quick pinch, decisive. The eyes were dots made with the end of a stick, and the tail had been the hardest part. He could feel the hesitation in the clay, where the maker had tried 3 different shapes before settling on a simple fan. This bird had been made by a woman who did not know how to make birds, but she had made one anyway because her daughter needed it, and need was stronger than skill. He felt the break. The wing had not been knocked off by a blow. It had separated along a fault line in the clay, where an air bubble had been trapped during firing. A structural weakness that was invisible from outside. The maker could not have known. The beak chip was from a fall, impact with a hard surface, stone floor probably. The tail had eroded from handling, years of small fingers rubbing the same spot over and over in the dark before sleep. The bird had been loved to pieces, literally. Teo held the pattern of its wholeness in his mind, every curve, every fingerprint, every imperfection that was not an error but a signature. And he restored it, slowly. 20 minutes of total focus on a grubby little clay bird that was worth nothing to anyone except a dying girl. The wing grew back, not smooth and perfect, rough and slightly too thick on the left side, because that was how it had been made. The beak reformed, one quick pinch of clay. The tail rounded and fanned out in the shape that the maker had settled on after 3 attempts, and the fingerprints stayed, every one, because they were part of the bird's truth, and restoration meant returning to truth, not improving on it. When he finished, he was breathing hard, not from the effort. The bird was tiny. The restoration had cost him almost nothing physically. He was breathing hard because of what he had felt in the clay, the weight of a mother's hands, the specific density of love pressed into an object that was meant to comfort a child through whatever was coming. He did not know what had happened to Lila's mother. He did not need to know. The bird told him everything. Someone had made this knowing it might be the last thing they ever made for their daughter. He placed it on Lila's pillow beside her face, close enough that she would see it when she opened her eyes, close enough that she would smell the clean clay smell of it newly whole. She opened her eyes, not all the way, just enough. She saw the bird. Her pupils moved, focused, recognized. Her hand came up from under the blanket and found it, and brought it to her cheek, and she pressed it there, against the gray skin that was slowly taking her. She closed her eyes again and made a small sound that was not a word, not a cry, something from further down than language, something that a child makes when the world stops being wrong for just a moment. Teo's hands were shaking, not from exhaustion, from the weight of what he still needed to do. This girl had a crystal shard in her chest that was killing her, and the only machine in the world that could save her was 3 days away in a dead city, and his body was broken from the last restoration, and the Baron might regroup at any time, and the Order of Ash was still out there, and none of it mattered as much as the fact that a 10-year-old girl had just pressed a clay bird against her face and made a sound like the world was briefly okay. He was going to save her. He did not know how yet, but the not knowing had never stopped him before. The fortress was transformed. He saw it when Sarah finally let him walk outside on the 8th day. She had made him wait 2 additional days after he woke because his blood pressure was unstable and his left ear was still not hearing properly, and she did not trust his balance enough to let him navigate stairs. He argued. She won. She always won medical arguments because she had learned that the most effective technique was to simply stand in the doorway and not move. On the 8th day, she stepped aside, and he walked out into the courtyard and stopped. Calder was whole. The walls were complete, not just standing, but finished. Battlements along the top, watchtower platforms at each corner, the stonework seamless and smooth, as if it had been built yesterday by 1,000 masons working in perfect coordination. The towers stood tall, both of them. The south tower, that had been a collapsed heap of rubble when they arrived, was now a full structure. 4 stories of black basalt with narrow windows at each level and a flat observation platform at the top, where Yun had already posted a permanent watch. The northeast tower was crowned with the beacon crystal that still burned. Teo could see it even in daylight, a pale white glow that would be blinding at night. The gate was sealed and perfect. He walked to it and placed his hand on the surface and felt the mechanism inside. Counterweights balanced to the gram, locking pins aligned to imperial tolerances. The distinctive click that the gate made when it closed was not just mechanical, it was musical. A specific frequency that resonated with the walls and told the entire structure that it was secure. He had not designed that. The Imperial engineers had. He had simply reminded the gate how it was supposed to sound. Every building in the complex had been partially restored by the cascade effect of his work on the resonator plate. The plate was the fortress's nervous system. When he had poured his ability into it, the restoration had propagated outward through every stone that was connected to the Imperial infrastructure grid. Walls that he had not touched directly were repaired. Floors that he had not seen were smoothed. The forge building had gained its second chimney. The original design had always included 2, but the second had collapsed decades ago and nobody had known it was supposed to be there. Now Dorvac was using both, and the draft was so much better that his forge temperature had increased by a third, and he could work steel that had been too stubborn for his old setup. The barracks were restored. 3 long buildings that could house 200 people in simple but solid rooms, with stone floors and intact roofs and shuttered windows that actually kept out the wind. The water system ran through every building. Pipes in the walls, taps in the kitchens, a drainage system that carried waste to a treatment pool outside the walls where imperial filtration crystals that Teo had not even known existed were quietly cleaning the outflow before it reached the river. Calder had functioning sewage treatment. 200 years after the fall of civilization, this fortress had sewage treatment because the Imperials had built it into the foundations, and Teo had woken it up. And people were coming. The beacon had been seen from every settlement within a day's ride. From further than that, probably, but the closer ones arrived first. Traders came with cartloads of goods, hoping to sell to a growing population. Refugees came from the northern villages, where the second wave of plague was pushing people south faster every week. Families came from Herod because word had spread that the man who fixed the water tower was building something in the hills, and it had walls and clean water and a forge and a school. The curious came because a tower of white light appearing on the horizon overnight was the kind of thing people needed to see for themselves. And the desperate came because desperation was the natural state of the world, and Calder was the first place in living memory that offered an alternative. Yoon had established a processing system at the gate. She took it seriously. Every arrival was interviewed: name, origin, skills, intentions. She asked the same 5 questions of everyone, and she watched their eyes when they answered. And Teo had learned that her judgment of character was almost never wrong. Anyone who could work was welcome: farmers, weavers, potters, cooks, a tanner, a candlemaker, a woman who claimed to be a surveyor, which turned out to be true and became immediately valuable. By the time Teo was on his feet, the population had doubled to nearly 100. The courtyard that had been empty 2 months ago now had foot traffic, people crossing between buildings carrying tools and food and materials, children running. The first children. 3 families had arrived with children under 10, and the sound of them playing in the courtyard changed the quality of the air in a way that Teo could not explain, but that everyone felt. Calder had been a project. Now it was starting to be a place. Ashley was running the forge, not assisting, running. Dorvac had been promoted, or perhaps the word was expanded. He now managed 3 construction teams that were working on the buildings Teo's restoration had not fully reached: the outer storage halls, the stable block, a long workshop building on the western side that had been a golem maintenance bay and was being converted into a general engineering workshop. Dorvac walked the site with a piece of chalk behind his ear and a leather apron that was never clean, and he directed people with a calm authority that Teo recognized as the natural leadership of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and did not need to prove it. Ashley had grown into the forge the way a plant grows into sunlight. She had reorganized the tool racks, established a production schedule, started training 2 new apprentices: a former farmer's son who had good hands, and a refugee woman in her 30s who had been a potter and understood heat and material, even if she had never worked metal. Ashley taught the way Teo taught: by showing, by doing, by placing her gloved hands over a student's hands and guiding them through the motion until the motion became memory. She still wore the gloves he had made her. They were darkened now with soot and oil, but the monogram on the right cuff was still visible. A.B. Her initials, her identity. Mir had set up a proper library in the restored records building. She had shelving now, real shelving. Dorvac's team had built it from salvaged timber, and Mir had organized every document in the archive by subject and date and language with a cross-reference index that she maintained in a ledger bound with imperial thread. The library had a table, 6 chairs, 2 oil lamps, and an atmosphere of such concentrated quiet purpose that even Cal the climber spoke in whispers when he entered. Cal was leading a crew now, 4 young people ranging from 12 to 17 who had the same gift for heights that he did. They inspected the upper walls, cleaned the beacon crystal housing, maintained the watchtower platforms, replaced damaged mortar in spots that adults could not reach. Cal had grown 2 inches since arriving at Calder, and his voice was starting to crack, and he was the happiest person in the fortress because he had found a place where being able to climb anything was not a novelty, but a necessity. The school had 30 students. 2 evenings a week had become 4. Teo taught engineering fundamentals. Mir taught reading and languages. Ashley taught basic metalwork. Yoon taught a class she called Awareness, which was part self-defense and part situational perception, and which she ran with the intensity of someone who believed that not knowing how to read a room could get you killed. Because it could. Things were moving fast, maybe too fast. Teo felt the momentum, and it thrilled him and worried him in equal measure. Solveig was waiting for him in the courtyard. She was sitting on the resonator plate, cross-legged, eating an apple and looking entirely unremarkable. Medium height, brown hair pulled back in a rough knot that she had tied with a strip of leather and clearly did not care about. A scar on her chin from a knife fight. Not a dramatic scar, a thin white line that you would not notice unless you were close. Clothes that were practical and patched and layered for warmth and told you absolutely nothing about who she was. She looked like exactly what she claimed to be. A drifter named Solve who had wandered into Calder during the siege and stayed because staying was easier than leaving. A nobody. She was the last living descendant of the Aaron Holt dynasty, the imperial bloodline that had ruled the Shining Empire for 11 generations. The blood that had built the cities, and the towers, and the golems, and the crystal networks, and the altars, and eventually the heart itself. She carried that weight so deep inside herself that it had become invisible, compressed by decades of hiding into something that looked from the outside like ordinary roughness. She ate the apple core and all. Teo had noticed that about her. She did not waste food. People who had spent years on the road did not waste food. She looked up at him as he approached, and her expression was neutral and evaluating. And she did not stand up, because standing up for someone was a gesture of respect, and she did not give respect by gesture. She gave it by listening. She told him her real name that morning, Solveig Aaron Holt. She said it flatly, without ceremony, without the weight that a name like that should carry, as if reporting the weather. The sky is gray. The wind is from the north. I am the last heir of the empire that broke the world. She said she had come to Calder because the beacon light had triggered something in her blood. She used that word, triggered, a physical response, a resonance she could not explain. The light had appeared on the horizon, and something in her chest had turned toward it the way a compass needle turns north. She had been 40 miles away. She had walked for 3 days without stopping for more than an hour at a time. She said she knew about the Order of Ash because they had been hunting her family for 2 centuries. Her parents had been killed by Ash agents when she was 16. Her uncle 3 years later. A cousin she had never met was reportedly executed in the Southern Territories 5 years ago. She was the last, and they knew it. And finding her was their final task before the imperial bloodline was truly extinct. She said she knew about the heart, the great artifact, the machine that had been built to restore anything and everything and had lost the ability to stop. She knew the official history. The heart went mad. The empire sacrificed itself to contain it. The Great Crash was the price of sealing the most dangerous creation in human history. She also knew the unofficial history, the one her mother had whispered to her in the dark on the night before the Ash agents came. The heart did not go mad. The heart did exactly what it was designed to do. It restored. Everything. Endlessly. It fixed the cracks in buildings and the rust on bridges and the sickness in bodies. And then it fixed the grief in hearts, and the disagreements between nations, and the independence of peoples who did not want to be fixed. It healed the world into compliance. It smoothed every rough edge until there were no edges left. And without edges, there were no boundaries. And without boundaries, there were no individuals. The empire had not sacrificed itself out of nobility. It had sacrificed itself because the alternative was a world where every broken thing was fixed and nothing new could ever grow, because growth requires breaking first. She said Teo's ability was connected to the heart. She could tell. Standing near him felt like standing near the old palace ruins where the heart had been housed. She had visited those ruins once at 17, alone, in secret, stupid and grieving and looking for something she could not name. She had stood in the central chamber where the heart had been sealed and felt it through the floor. A warmth, a hum, a presence that was not alive but was not dead either. Standing near Teo felt the same. Same frequency, same warmth, same danger. Teo did not deny it. He had suspected for weeks. The evidence had been accumulating in small ways that he had chosen not to examine too closely because examining them meant confronting something he was not ready to confront. The way his ability grew stronger with each major restoration. The lamp in Molly's skull had been easy, the mill easier. The water tower had cost him 4 days of unconsciousness. The fortress had cost him 6 days and 2 cardiac arrests. But the ability itself was more powerful each time. The scope of what he could restore was expanding. The speed was increasing. The depth of his comprehension was deepening. He understood more about imperial technology after each restoration than he had before it, as if the act of fixing opened doors in his mind that had been locked. The pulling in his skull that he felt near broken things was louder now. Not just near imperial artifacts, near everything. A cracked cup on a table, a frayed rope on a wall, a loose stone in a floor. The world was full of broken things, and he could feel all of them all the time now, like a radio tuned to a frequency that never stopped broadcasting. And the healing crystal in the altar at Old Aaron, that had been the most telling sign. The crystal had responded to him, not as a tool responds to a user, but as a thing responds to something that is part of itself. It had recognized him, a fragment recognizing the whole, or the whole recognizing a fragment. He was connected to the heart. His ability was a piece of it, a splinter, a seed. And the more he used it, the more it grew. Solveig said the Order of Ash would not stop. The siege had been Vekkult, and the guild with Ash support. But the Ash commitment had been minimal. A dozen agents embedded in the Baron's forces, observers. The real Ash response was still coming. They believed that any restoration of imperial technology brought the world closer to a second crash. They had spent 200 years making sure the old technology stayed dead, sabotaging repair attempts, assassinating anyone who showed genuine understanding of imperial systems, burning archives, killing scholars. Meyer's father had been right to be paranoid. The Ash had been watching him. They would have come for his archive eventually. They would have come for Meyer. And now they would come for Teo, because Teo was not just someone who could fix imperial technology. Teo was imperial technology, a walking fragment of the thing they feared most. They were not wrong. Solveig said this without judgment. They were not wrong to be afraid. The heart had nearly destroyed everything. It had erased cities, rewritten populations, smoothed entire cultures into uniformity, because it could not distinguish between a crack in a wall and a crack in a society. If Teo's fragment continued to grow, it might reach a threshold where it began operating independently, fixing things without his consent, without his knowledge, fixing things that should not be fixed, fixing people, their injuries, their illnesses, their grief, their anger, their individuality, fixing death, fixing the past, restoring what was gone as if loss were just another form of breakage. The heart had not been evil. Teo needed to understand that. It had simply lost the ability to distinguish between repair and control, between helping and overwriting, between restoring a thing to what it was and remaking it into what the heart thought it should be. That was why the Empire had sacrificed itself, not to destroy the heart, because it could not be destroyed, but to contain it, to silence it, to buy the world time to figure out a better answer than a machine that fixed everything, whether everything wanted to be fixed or not. And now a piece of that machine was alive inside a man who loved fixing things more than anything in the world. A man who could not see a broken cup without wanting to make it whole. A man who heard the pain of damaged objects as a physical sensation, and who had structured his entire identity around the act of restoration. The cruelest possible trap. A fragment of infinite repair bonded to a soul that could not stop repairing. Solveig watched him as she said this. She watched his face. And Teo understood that she was not just telling him the truth. She was testing him, watching to see if he would flinch, if he would deny, if he would rationalize, if he would reach for the easy answer, which was that he was different and he could control it and it would be fine. He did not flinch. He did not deny. He sat on the resonator plate beside her and looked at his hands and was quiet for a long time. Then he asked what his options were. Solveig said there were two. Stop using the ability entirely. Let the fragment go dormant. It would not die because it could not die, but it would sleep. And Teo would become an ordinary man in a world that desperately needed someone extraordinary. Lila would die. The altar in Old Erin would sit dark and unused. The golems would eventually break down without his maintenance. The beacon would fade. Calder would survive for a while on the momentum of what he had already built. But without him, the technology would degrade and the people would forget, and in a generation, it would be ruins again. The second option was to find the heart itself. Go to the vault beneath Old Erin where the last emperor had sealed it. Stand before the most dangerous creation in human history and make a choice. Absorb it and become something more than human with all the risks that implied. Or find a way to neutralize it permanently. Or something else, something nobody had thought of yet, because nobody had ever been in the position of having a fragment of the heart with the knowledge to understand what it meant and the will to do something about it. Teo said stopping was not an option. He said it without drama, without heroic resolve. He said it the way he would say that a cracked beam needed reinforcement before you put weight on it, a statement of structural necessity. Lila would die. The people of Calder would lose everything they had built. The region would slide back into darkness and plague and despair. The knowledge in Meyer's archive would be lost again. The school would close. The forge would cool. Ashley would go back to being a girl with burned hands and no future. The well would seize. The water would stop. Everything he had fixed would break again, and this time, there would be no one to fix it. Solveig said she knew. That was why it was cruel. Because the right choice and the safe choice were not the same, and they could never be the same, and that was the trap the heart had set, whether it meant to or not. He asked where the heart was. She said deep beneath Old Erin, in the central vault, under the palace, under the chamber where she had stood at 17 and felt it humming through the floor. The last emperor had sealed it there with everything he had, every crystal in the palace, every resonator in the city, every imperial engineer who survived the initial catastrophe had worked together in the final hours to build a containment that would hold for as long as stone lasted. 200 years so far, stone lasted a long time, but not forever. She said the Order of Ash was looking for it too, not to use it, to destroy it. They had been searching for 2 centuries. They did not know the exact location, but they were getting closer, and they intended to destroy it along with anyone connected to it, including Teo. He made his decision that night, sitting on the resonator plate after Solveig had gone, alone in the courtyard with the beacon burning above him and the stars of an alien sky scattered overhead. The cracked moon hung in the east like a broken mirror, reflecting light it had no right to reflect. He would go to Old Erin one more time. But first, he would save Lila. That was the order. Not the heart first, not the grand mission first, the girl first. Because if he lost sight of the girl in pursuit of the greater good, then he was already becoming the thing Solveig was afraid of. The heart had fixed the world. He was going to fix one child. That was the difference, and he intended to hold on to it with both hands. He told Sarah in the morning. She listened and then said she would go with him. He said she was needed in Calder. She said Lila was her patient and she did not abandon patience. He did not argue because he recognized the look on her face. It was the same look she had given him when she stood in the doorway and would not move. He told Meyer to gather every medical text from the archive that related to the medicinal altar and crystal contamination treatment. Meyer had the documents assembled in 2 hours. She had already been compiling them. She had known he would go. She asked to come, and he said yes because he would need her to read the altar's operational texts in real time during the procedure. He told Yoon to choose 2 of her best guards for the journey. Yoon chose 2 and then added herself. He said she was needed on the wall. She said the wall had Polk and Aaron and 12 trained volunteers, and if he thought she was letting him walk into the most dangerous ruin on the continent without her, then he had learned nothing about her in all these months. He did not argue because he recognized this look too. It was different from Sarah's look. It was quieter, harder. It came from a place that did not negotiate. He told Ashley to keep building, to finish the second golem, to maintain the forge and the school and the production schedule, and to not burn anything down. She said she would try. She was lying about the last part, and they both knew it. He told Dorvac to keep the construction on schedule and to listen to Solveig if decisions needed to be made. Dorvac nodded. He was not a man who needed detailed instructions. He told Solveig that when he came back, they would talk about the heart and the future and what kind of world they were going to build together. She looked at him and said he was assuming he would come back. He said he was a restaurator. He did not leave work unfinished. She almost smiled. The almost was important. A full smile would have been agreement. The almost was acknowledgement that she had heard him and appreciated the sentiment, but did not share his confidence. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out something small, a wooden horse, crudely carved from a piece of pale birch, one leg broken off at the knee, the other 3 worn smooth by years of handling. The paint that had once covered it was faded to nothing, just bare wood, with ghost traces of color in the grain. She said her mother had carved it for her when she was 5. It was the last birthday before things got bad, before the running started, before the ash found them and her world collapsed. The horse broke when she fled her home at 16. She was climbing out of a window in the dark with agents in the house and her mother's screaming in the room behind her, and she hit the ground wrong and the horse fell from her pocket and the leg snapped on the cobblestones. She had picked up both pieces and kept running, and she had carried them ever since. 10 years. 10 years of carrying a broken horse in her coat pocket. She did not ask him to fix it. She did not say please. She did not explain why it mattered. She just held it out. Both pieces, the horse and the tiny broken leg. Offering them the way you offer something precious to someone you have decided to trust against your better judgment. Teo took them. He held the horse in his left hand and the leg in his right, and he felt the wood. Birch, light, fine-grained, carved with a small knife by hands that were strong but not practiced. The cuts were deep in some places and shallow in others. The proportions were off. The legs were too thick for the body. The head was too small. The mane was suggested by a series of notches rather than actually carved. But it was a horse. Unmistakably a horse, made by a woman who had probably never carved anything before, but who had a daughter turning 5 and wanted to give her something that came from her own hands. He felt the break. Clean. Impact fracture. The wood fibers had separated along the grain at the thinnest point of the leg, a stress point that the carver could not have anticipated. He felt the paint, under the surface, soaked into the wood grain. Red on the body, gold on the mane. Imperial colors. The colors of the dynasty that Solveig's mother had been born into and had died for. She had painted her daughter's birthday present in the colors of their house. A tiny act of defiance, a declaration of identity hidden in a child's toy. Teo restored it. The leg reconnected. The wood fibers knit together, the grain aligned. And under the faded surface, the paint came back. Not bright, not new, but present. Red on the body like old brick. Gold on the mane like autumn wheat. Warm colors, living colors. The colors of a house that had fallen, but whose blood was sitting 3 feet away, eating apple cores and carrying the weight of a dead empire on shoulders that refused to bow. He gave it back without a word. Because words would have been wrong. Words would have made it a moment, and it was not a moment. It was a repair, a thing returned to what it was. Nothing more. Everything more. Solveig held the horse. Her face did not change. She had spent too many years controlling her face to let it change for anything short of mortal danger. But her hand was trembling, a fine vibration that traveled from her fingers up through her wrist and into the arm that she held rigidly at her side. Her jaw was set. The scar on her chin stood out white against skin that had flushed faintly. She turned the horse over, saw the paint, the red, the gold, her mother's colors, her mother's hands in the wood, her mother's last birthday gift returned to the state it had been in on the morning a 5-year-old girl had opened her eyes and found it beside her bed and screamed with joy. When Solveig spoke, her voice was thick, and she did not try to hide it. She said that tonight was the end of the old world. She said that she had spent 10 years carrying a broken thing because she believed that broken was all she deserved. She said tomorrow they would start building the new one. Not restoring the old empire, not repeating the mistakes of her bloodline, building something that had never existed before. Something better. She said she was glad he was here. Then she put the horse in her pocket. Not her coat pocket where she had carried the broken pieces. Her shirt pocket, over her heart. She went to her room and did not come out until morning. And in the morning, her eyes were clear, dry, focused. Her back was straight. She walked across the courtyard with a stride that was different from the day before. Longer, more certain. The walk of someone who had put something down that she had been carrying for a very long time and had discovered that without the weight, she was taller than she thought. Teo stood in the courtyard at dawn. The beacon burned above him, white light against a gray sky. The walls stood whole and high, and the stone was warm under his feet because the resonator plate was still active, still humming, still connected to every stone in the fortress. He placed his hand on the ground and felt Calder. All of it. 120 people breathing inside walls that had been dead for 2 centuries. He could feel the forge fire in the south building, the water moving through the pipes, the golem clicking along its track in the field outside the walls, the crystals in the beacon tower vibrating at their maintenance frequency, the library where Meyer's lamp was already lit because she had been up since before dawn organizing the medical texts for the journey, the infirmary where Sarah was checking Lila's vitals one more time before travel, the wall where Yoon was completing her final inspection of the guard rotation she had set for their absence. He could feel all of it, not as sound, not as vision, as presence, as the hum of a living thing that had been built from broken pieces by broken people who had decided that broken was not the end. He could hear the forge, Ashley starting early, metal on metal. She was making nails. She made nails every morning before moving to more complex work. A ritual, a warm-up, a meditation that happened to produce something useful. He could hear Yoon drilling her guards, short commands, precise corrections. She never raised her voice during drills. She did not need to. He could hear Cal's crew on the upper walls, climbing and laughing and calling to each other in the shorthand they had developed for describing structural conditions. Crack at 7, loose at 12, solid at 15. He could hear Meyer turning pages in the library, the particular whisper of old paper being handled with care. He could hear Sarah talking to Lila in a low, calm voice, explaining what was going to happen, where they were going, why. She spoke to the girl the way she spoke to all her patients, directly, without condescension, without false comfort. Here is what is happening. Here is what we are going to do. Here is why I believe it will work. He could hear the golem clicking in the field, that steady metronome beat that meant the soil was being turned and the seed was being planted and the harvest would come and people would eat. He could hear water running through the pipes, clean water, the sound that had started everything. He was a restaurator. That was the word he had started using for himself. Not a reader of ruins, not a wizard, not a hero. A restorator. Someone who returned things to what they were meant to be. He fixed things for people. Not for glory, not for power, not for the abstract satisfaction of making broken things whole. For people. For Bran, who ate dinner in the dark for 40 years. For the woman at the mill who pressed her hands over her mouth. For the children of Herod who drank clean water for the first time. For Lila, who held a clay bird against her cheek. For Solveig, who found her mother's colors in the grain of old wood. For Ashley, who slept in her gloves. For Yoon, who held stars in her fist. For Meyer, who did not betray but preserved. And the biggest repair of his life was just beginning. He picked up his pack, checked his tools, a set of fine picks he had made in the forge, a leather roll of brushes, a magnifying lens that Ashley had ground from a crystal offcut, a notebook where he had sketched every imperial mechanism he had encountered, his hands, his knowledge, his stubbornness. He walked toward the gate where Sarah and Yoon and Meyer were waiting. Sarah had Lila in a carrying frame on her back. The girl was too weak to walk. The clay bird was in her hand. Yoon had her bow and a short sword and the look of someone who intended to bring everyone back alive and would accept no alternative. Meyer had the medical texts in a leather case and the codex in her coat and her crooked spectacles on her nose and her father's courage in her spine. They were going to Old Erin, to the dead city, to the altar that could save one girl's life. And beneath the altar, deep in the vaults below the palace, the heart waited. The thing that had broken the world, the thing that lived inside him, the thing he would eventually have to face. But not today. Today, he was going to save a girl. Behind him, Calder stood in the morning light, whole, new, ready. 120 people building something from the rubble of something that had fallen. Not an empire, not yet, maybe not ever. Something smaller and warmer and harder to break because it was held together not by a machine, but by hands. Human hands, scarred and calloused and tired and stubborn and reaching for each other in the dark. And above it all, the beacon burned, a light in the darkness, a signal to every broken settlement and every dying village and every desperate person within sight of the horizon. Come. There is clean water here. There is warm fire. There is a school where your children can learn to read the old writing. There is a forge where your hands can make things that matter. There is a man who will sit on the floor in the middle of a diplomatic crisis to fix a clay bird for a dying girl. Come, bring your broken things. We fix them here. Not by gods, not by emperors, not by a machine that cannot tell the difference between help and control. By hands, by knowledge, by patience, by the stubborn, ordinary love of a man who looked at a shattered world and said, "Fine. What needs fixing first?"